Tension in tabletop role-playing games is often associated with danger. Monsters, combat, threats that place characters at risk. But tension rarely comes from danger alone. Players can face enormous threats and still feel very little pressure. Because tension does not come from the presence of danger. It comes from uncertainty about what that danger might become. When outcomes are predictable, players quickly adapt. But when the situation remains uncertain, every decision becomes more difficult. And that uncertainty is what sustains tension at the table. When outcomes become predictable, players begin optimizing solutions rather than worrying about risks. The structure of the situation becomes stable. Once players understand how the threat behaves, they stop treating it as an unknown danger. Instead, they begin treating it as a problem with a known solution. They learn the creature's abilities. They learn how encounters with it usually unfold. And eventually, they begin planning around those patterns. At that point, the threat still exists, but the uncertainty surrounding it has disappeared. The players are no longer wondering what might happen. They are calculating what will happen. And once the structure of a situation becomes predictable, tension begins to disappear. In one campaign, the players encountered the same type of creature several times. At first, the encounters were tense. But after a few sessions, the players understood exactly how the creatures behaved. The threat had not changed, but the uncertainty had disappeared. And with it, the tension. When outcomes become predictable, players begin optimizing solutions rather than worrying about risk. The situation transforms from uncertainty into strategy. Tension returns when the structure of the situation remains partially unknown. Players must make decisions without fully understanding the consequences. Danger alone does not create tension. Players can face extremely powerful threats and still feel very little pressure if they understand exactly how those threats behave. Once a danger becomes predictable, players begin treating it as a problem to solve rather than a risk to fear. They learn what the enemy can do. They learn how encounters unfold. And eventually, they develop strategies that reliably overcome the threat. The danger itself has not disappeared, but the uncertainty surrounding it has. And tension rarely survives once the outcome of a situation becomes predictable. Tension requires pressure, but pressure only appears when the situation continues changing. When a threat remains static for long enough, players begin adapting to it. The danger becomes part of the background of the campaign. The players know the threat exists, but they also know that nothing is forcing them to act immediately. Over time, the situation begins to feel stable. And once players believe the situation is stable, urgency disappears. Pressure emerges when the structure of the situation continues evolving. When the world moves forward, whether the players act or not. Because when delay carries consequences, every decision about when to act becomes meaningful. In one investigation, the players knew something dangerous was happening in the town. But session after session passed with very little change. The situation remained stable. And eventually the players began treating the threat as nothing more than background information. Tension requires pressure. When the situation does not evolve, players adapt to it. Stable tension emerges when the situation changes over time. Pressure builds gradually, and players begin to feel that delay carries consequences. Tension rarely appears in a single moment. It grows when pressure builds over time. Players learn that delaying action has consequences. Situations evolve even when the players are not directly interacting with them. And the longer a problem remains unresolved, the more complicated it becomes. This gradual escalation creates a sense that the situation is unstable. The players are not simply solving a puzzle. They are responding to a structure that continues changing around them. And when pressure builds in that way, even small decisions begin to feel significant. Certainty stabilizes the structure of the situation. Once players believe they understand the entire shape of the problem, the remaining steps become procedural. They know what the threat is. They know where it's coming from, and they know what needs to be done to stop it. From that moment forward, the campaign shifts from discovery to execution. Now, execution can still be dramatic, but it rarely produces the same tension as uncertainty, because tension depends on the possibility that the player's understanding of the situation may still be incomplete. When that uncertainty disappears, the structure of the problem becomes stable, and stable problems rarely sustain tension. I remember one campaign, the players eventually discovered the entire structure of the investigation. They knew what the threat was, they knew where it was coming from, and they knew exactly how to stop it. From that moment forward, the campaign shifted from tension to nothing more than execution. Certainty stabilizes the situation, and stability reduces tension. Tension persists when the structure of the situation remains partially hidden. Players must act without fully understanding the consequences. The most tense moments at the table often occur when players must act without fully understanding the entire situation. They know something's wrong. They know the situation is dangerous, but they do not yet understand the entire structure of the problem. So they make decisions based on incomplete information. Sometimes those decisions work. Sometimes they make the situation worse. But uncertainty forces players to weigh every action carefully. Because when the outcome cannot be predicted, every decision becomes a risk. Tension in tabletop role-playing games rarely comes from just the danger alone. It comes from uncertainty, from evolving pressure, from situations whose outcomes remain unclear. Because when players cannot fully predict what will happen next, every decision becomes meaningful.